Hello and welcome to Photosynthesis. It's so good to be back on the recording scene. And here we go. Let's talk about photosynthesis. So carbon dioxide photosynthesis is a carbon dioxide requiring process that uses light energy, or the photons, and water to produce organic macromolecules, which is glucose. Ooh, that sounds exciting, huh? Basically, that is, we're going to use carbon dioxide and water with the photons from the sun, and we're going to produce glucose, and oxygen's going to be released. Here's the formula. This is in words. Here's it written out, way easier to understand. So we're going to have 6 carbon dioxides plus 6 waters. We have photons from the sun, which are required for this reaction to happen. We're going to ultimately end up with glucose and 6 oxygens. Now, here you need to know this equation. You need to know it just as it is, every part. You need to know all the numbers here. You need to know all the formulas, everything. All right, so just commit this to memory right now. Guaranteed this is on the test. Okay, so let's look at plants. Plants are autotrophs. Auto means self, troph means feed. They're self-feeders. They produce their own food, which is glucose. This process is called photosynthesis, and it mainly occurs in the leaves, which is in a structure called the stoma. It's on the underside of leaves, and it looks like it looks like this. It's got these guard cells here, and these will swell or shrink and open up this hole if carbon dioxide or oxygen needs to be released or carbon dioxide needs to be taken in. And so on the underside of leaves, that's important to know, the underside of the leaves is where this gas exchange happens in gases, meaning oxygen and carbon dioxide, and that occurs in the stoma. Now this picture right here is a plant cell. Very crude drawing, but it is a plant cell. And here you have this gigantic vacuole and your cell wall around here, but here's your nucleus, but these in here is the chloroplast. All right, so these stoma, like I said, this is the place where gas exchange happens. So they're like pores. Think of pores in your skin. So there are basically holes in there. And these guard cells, like I said, will swell or shrink depending on whether or not they need to let something in or out. So the pores in the plant's cuticle is for water vapor and the gases, and it's exchanged between the plant and the atmosphere. So it'll release what it has inside out into the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide can go in there, can go in, and oxygen out. Again, this is a really good picture, real important one, showing that oxygen is leaving because that's a product of photosynthesis. Carbon dioxide is going in because that's a reactant. It's needed for photosynthesis. And again, found on the underside of the leaves. All right, this is just showing you a diagram, this mesophyll cell of the leaf. This is just showing more of a close-up, but you need to know that photosynthesis occurs in these cells. It actually occurs right here in the chloroplast. And speaking of the chloroplast, here's some of our structures of the chloroplast here. All right, the chloroplast is the organelle where photosynthesis takes place. Sorry, that strange cough that I get. Here again, very crude drawing of a chloroplast, but you have your inner membrane, your outer membrane. Now, every one of these things plays a role, an important part. We're not going to go that deep into the details, though. I mean, we could literally study this like crazy. There's so much. But you do need to know that each one of these individual structures here is called a thylakoid, and then the whole stack here is called the granum. And then surrounding the thylakoid is an area called the stroma. This is important because we're going to talk about the light reactions occurring here in the thylakoid and the Calvin cycle occurring out here in the stroma. All right, a little close-up here of our thylakoid. Okay, so The grana make up the inner membrane here. We have the thylakoid, and then of course the membrane surrounding it, and it's just like any other membrane. It's a phospholipid bilayer. It's two-layer there, and then the space on the inside here. All right, so let's look at the chlorophyll molecule. Now we've already done this in looking at the lab that we did last week and looking at the wavelengths of color. Chloro means green, and these chlorophyll molecules are located in the thylakoid membranes. And if you recall from what we talked about last week, that chlorophyll pigment absorbs certain wavelengths, mainly blue, but we saw both blue and red, or we should have seen both blue and red. And of course plants are green because the green wavelength is reflected. It's not absorbed. We saw the blue being absorbed, but we didn't see the green being absorbed in our results. And this is just a spectrum showing you this wavelength of light, and it's measured in nanometers. And so when we looked at the colors, we saw them go through the spectrophotometer at these different wavelengths. All right, and then here is what our graph should have looked like. We would have seen a big peak here at blue because there was a lot of absorption taking place at the blue. Another peak down here at red, and then you can see it's just not absorbed at the green. It's reflected at that point. All right, and we did talk about fall colors. This is where those other pigments are always there, that red, orange, yellow. So right now when we look outside and we see these changing leaf colors, those have always been there. The only reason why we don't see green now, and we get to see the other ones, is that that green chlorophyll pigment is greatly reduced at this time of year. And so photosynthesis, we're not having that occur once we don't have the chlorophyll. And then obviously once it changes to the red, orange, or yellow leaves, then photosynthesis is done because those leaves will drop off. All right, sunlight. Sunlight is the ultimate energy for all life on Earth. It's the photons there that will stimulate the electron activity and cause photosynthesis to take place. Plants store the energy in the chemical bonds of sugar. It stores it there. It's called potential energy because it has the potential to do some work there. And so how the energy is released is those bonds are broken. And so that chemical energy is released as ATP during cellular respiration. That's the next thing that we'll talk about after we finish up here with photosynthesis. But breaking those bonds releases that energy. All right, like I said before, you have to know this equation. There's no option here. And this is such a simplified version, but you need to understand this. So we're starting off with 6 carbon dioxide and 6 waters and sunlight. Got to have the sunlight. Now these here are called reactants, and then these are products. So we end up with a macromolecule, a glucose molecule, which is a carbohydrate, and then we have here oxygen is released from the plant and heat is given off. Now notice I have color coding here. The water splits using the sunlight energy. The water splits. So see how this water here, and then you'll see it split. So this hydrogen is going over here to the hydrogens, and this oxygen is the oxygen that's released. It's not the CO2. The CO2 comes in another reaction. All right, now I said this one we were going to get to, and I just absolutely love this picture because let's go back here for a second. Okay, remember, you have to remember this formula. So we're going to look at the reactants and we're going to look at the products coming out. Okay, so here's our reactants. Here's water, carbon dioxide, and sunlight. That's going into, here's our chloroplast. So those are going into the chloroplast, and our products are oxygen and the sugar, which is glucose. So water goes into the light reactions, into the thylakoids. So you have water coming in, and light is going to cause all kinds of things to happen as a result. oxygen's given off. Remember we said the oxygen is coming from hydrogen, or I mean from the water, not the CO2. Okay, so you can see this is all occurring in the light reactions. As a result of the light reactions, ATP and NADPH are produced. There's a lot of information involved with this, but we're just going to keep it real simple. We're going to roll that ATP and NADPH here into the Calvin cycle. Another name, a couple of other names you'll hear for the Calvin cycle. You'll hear them called the dark reactions. We don't like to use that name anymore because it infers that it's happening in the dark. It's not. It's still happening in the light. It just doesn't have to have light for this reaction to occur. The light has to be over here. You'll also hear it called the light independent reactions, which is what I like best because the light independent, this one's light dependent, this one's light independent. So the ATP and NADPH rolls into the Calvin cycle and allows now the CO2 comes in, one of the reactants, the CO2 comes in, and there's just all kinds of things that happen. There's lots of conversions that take place in this process. And eventually what happens is a sugar is spit out. It's actually a 3-carbon sugar, and then you have to have that happen a couple of times. But we're just going to keep it at glucose. And then it's called the cycle because it continues to roll through. So as ATP and NADPH, as those go through a process of this bond breaking, and we end up with adenosine diphosphate, and this phosphate group that's just separate because that bond's been broken, and this NADP plus where it was an NADPH. So the electrons were taken off, and then they will cycle back into the light reactions because they will be part of the reactants needed for this reaction to take place. All right, so here's our light reactions and the Calvin cycle. You need to be able to reproduce this, this picture right here. Oh, and that's it. That's the end of our show for today. I hope you've enjoyed the show and have a marvelous day.